Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story is of Carl Jung, a seeker of shadows, who dared to map the hidden continents of the mind. Relax as we explore the life and work of Carl Jung, a man who walked between worlds, who descended into his own darkness and returned bearing symbols, who listened to the dreams of humanity and heard the whispers of something older than consciousness itself, who explored the mind, discovering vast reservoirs of shared imagery buried beneath personal memory, uncovering the architecture of the soul through myth and symbol, through the careful observation of what rises unbidden from the depths when we dare to look within. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychology and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the landscape of the soul. Tell me in the comments, what draws you most: the mystery of dreams, the spark of emotion, the intangibility of spirit, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the life and work of Carl Jung as we wander the corridors of the unconscious and listen to the whispering mind beneath the mind. In the summer of 1875, in the small Swiss village of Keswell on the shores of Lake Constance, a child was born who would grow to become one of the great explorers of the interior world. Carl Jung entered this world on July 26th. Delivered into a household steeped in religious tradition, yet shadowed by unspoken tensions. His father, Johann Paul Achilles Jung, served as a Protestant pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, a man of faith, but also, as his son will later observe, a man troubled by doubts he could not voice. His mother, Emilie Preiswerk Jung, came from a family with a curious history. The Preiswerks were known for their interest in spiritualism and matters of the unseen, a lineage that would leave its mark on young Carl's developing imagination. The landscape of Carl's childhood was one of contrasts. The visible world offered the placid beauty of Swiss lakes and mountains, the orderly progression of Protestant ritual, the certainty of a bourgeois existence in the latter decades of the 19th century. But beneath the surface ran currents of mystery and disturbance. His mother suffered from what we might now recognize as episodes of psychological distress, periods when she seemed to become a different person entirely. The young Carl learned early that human beings contain multiplicities, that a single person might harbor more than one personality, more than one way of being in the world. At night, he would sometimes hear his mother speaking in voices that were not quite her own, and he came to believe that she had what he would later term a dual personality by day, the conventional pastor's wife, by night, something wilder and more prophetic. This early encounter with the divided nature of the psyche planted seeds that would bloom throughout his life's work. Carl was a solitary child, given to long periods of introspection and imaginative play. He felt himself different from other children, set apart by thoughts and perceptions that seemed to find no echo in the world around him. He experienced what he would later describe as two personalities within himself. Personality number 1, the schoolboy who lived in the ordinary world of lessons and social expectations, and personality number 2, a figure he sensed as ancient and wise, connected to something far older than his young lifetime. The second personality felt like an old man from the 18th century, dignified and knowing, existing somehow simultaneously with the child Carl. The family moved when Carl was quite young, first to Laufen near the Rhine Falls, and then when he was 4 to Kleinhüningen near Basel, where they would remain for many years. The father's career as a country parson did not flourish, as perhaps had been hoped, and financial constraints marked the household. Young Carl was aware of tensions between his parents, of his father's growing bitterness and his mother's occasional retreats into strangeness. Into this uncertain emotional landscape, Carl carved out spaces of his own places in the garden, secret rituals and games that created for him a sense of meaning and continuity. One of his earliest and most significant memories involved a carved wooden mannequin, a small figure he fashioned and hid in the attic, along with a smooth stone from the Rhine, painted to look divided into an upper and lower half. This little mannequin became a secret treasure, a confidant in times of emotional distress. When the tensions of family life became too much, Carl would think of his mannequin hidden away, and he would feel comforted, as though he possessed a mystery that was his alone. This experience prefigured his later understanding of symbols and their autonomous power, the way certain images can carry psychic energy and provide a sense of connection to something beyond the personal ego. He was also subject to powerful dreams and visions from an early age. One dream in particular haunted him throughout his life. In this dream, experienced when he was between 3 and 4 years old, he found himself in a meadow near his home. He discovered a dark, rectangular stone-lined hole in the ground, with a stone stairway leading down. Filled with fearful curiosity, he descended into the darkness and found himself in a rectangular chamber with a vaulted ceiling. On the floor lay a rich carpet, and on this carpet stood a golden throne. Upon this throne sat something that would become for him an image of terrible and numinous power. A massive, upright, cylindrical form made of skin and naked flesh, reaching from the throne almost to the ceiling. It had a rounded top, and on that top was a single eye, gazing motionlessly upward. The child felt paralyzed with terror, and then heard his mother's voice from outside and above, calling out that this was the man-eater, the devourer. He awoke in absolute dread, sweating and terrified. This dream, which Jung would only fully discuss in his old age, represented for him a primal encounter with the dark, chthonic forces of the unconscious. The phallic god underground, the terrible throne in the underworld, became a secret counter-image to the Christian teachings of his father's church. Where the church spoke of Jesus meek and mild, the dream revealed something older, more primitive, more powerful, and more frightening. This was not the God of light and mercy, but something that dwelt in the depths, something that had to do with the earth and flesh and the devouring aspects of existence. For a child in a pastor's home, such an image could not be spoken of, could not be integrated into the conscious worldview he was being taught. It remained below, a secret knowledge, a gnosis of the darkness. School proved difficult for the boy. He was bright, certainly, but did not fit easily into the social world of his peers. He felt himself observed and judged, felt himself somehow fraudulent, as though the schoolboy self were a performance and his real being lay elsewhere. Impersonality number 2. In the realm of dreams and stones, and the dark god underground, he struggled with fainting spells during his early school years, episodes that might now be understood as dissociative or anxiety-related. He discovered, with a peculiar self-awareness that would characterize his entire life, that he could bring on these fainting spells when faced with the prospect of school or homework. The unconscious, he realized, had its own intelligence, its own strategies for avoiding what it could not bear. This realization shocked him into a kind of early maturity. One day, after overhearing his father express worry about Carl's future to a friend, expressing concern that the boy might never be able to make his own living, Carl felt something shift within him. He forced himself to return to his studies, fought against the fainting spells, and gradually overcame them through sheer will. This experience taught him something essential. The unconscious is powerful, but consciousness can struggle with it, can negotiate with it, can establish a working relationship rather than simply being swept away. It was an early lesson in what he would later call individuation, the process by which consciousness and the unconscious come into dialogue. As he moved through his teenage years, Carl became a voracious reader. He devoured philosophy and theology, searching for answers to questions that burned within him. What is the nature of reality? What is God? What is the relationship between matter and spirit? His father's conventional Christianity seemed to offer only hollow formulas, words emptied of living meaning. Carl watched his father perform the rituals of faith and sensed the despair beneath them, the doubt that could not be admitted. The young man vowed he would not make that mistake. He would face his doubts. He would pursue the questions wherever they led, even into darkness. He read Kant and Schopenhauer, Goethe and Nietzsche. He became fascinated by Goethe's Faust, that great drama of a man who makes a pact with the dark powers in order to experience the fullness of existence. The figure of Mephistopheles intrigued him. Was not the devil also a part of God's creation? Was not darkness necessary for consciousness, as the Faustian drama seemed to suggest? These were not merely academic questions for Carl. They were personal, existential, rooted in his own dream of the underground God and in the divided nature of his own being. When the time came to choose a path for university studies, Carl faced a difficult decision. The family had little money, and his mother's relatives hoped he might study theology and follow his father into the ministry. But Carl knew that path was closed to him. He could not in good conscience preach doctrines he questioned. He was drawn to the humanities, to philosophy and archaeology, the study of ancient things. But practical considerations intruded. He needed a profession that would allow him to earn a living and perhaps to help support his family. He settled on medicine as a compromise, a scientific discipline that would still allow him to grapple with questions of human nature. In 1895, at the age of 19, Carl Jung began his medical studies at the University of Basel. The young student threw himself into his work with characteristic intensity. He studied anatomy and physiology, chemistry and pathology, all the material sciences of the body. But his mind continued to range beyond the merely physical. He joined a student fraternity, the Zofingia Club, where he delivered several talks that revealed the preoccupations of his inner life. He spoke of the limitations of scientific materialism, of the possibility of spiritual realities beyond the reach of empirical measurement, of the strange phenomena of spiritualism and mediumship that his mother's family had been interested in. During these university years, Carl also became involved in seances conducted by his young cousin, Ellen Pricework, who claimed to be in contact with spirits of the dead. Carl attended these sessions with a scientist's curiosity and a psychologist's eye. He observed Ellen carefully, noting how she would enter trance states and speak in different voices, claiming to channel various spirits. Rather than dismissing this as mere fraud or delusion, Carl became fascinated by the psychological mechanisms at work. How could a young, relatively uneducated girl suddenly speak with eloquence and authority about philosophical matters? How could distinct personalities emerge through her, each with its own character and perspective? He would. We later write his medical dissertation on these seances, titled On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena. In this early work, we can already see the outlines of his mature thought. Rather than explaining Hélène's experiences away as simple hysteria or conscious fraud, Jung explored them as manifestations of unconscious psychological processes. The spirits, he suggested, might be understood as autonomous complexes, split-off portions of the psyche that took on independent life in the dissociated state of trance. This was not to deny the reality of the phenomena as psychological facts, but rather to investigate them with seriousness and curiosity rather than reductive dismissal. As Jung neared the end of his medical studies, he faced another crucial decision: what medical specialty to pursue. He had been considering surgery or internal medicine, the prestigious paths for an ambitious young doctor. But then, in preparing for his final examinations in 1900, he happened to pick up a textbook on psychiatry written by the eminent German physician Richard von Krafft-Ebing. As Jung later recounted, his hands began to tremble as he read the introduction. Krafft-Ebing described psychiatry as the study of diseases of the personality, and spoke of textbooks on psychiatry as stamped with the subjective character of more or less gifted authors. In that moment, Jung felt a shock of recognition. Here was a field that stood at the intersection of biology and spirit, science and the humanities, medicine and philosophy. Here was the path he had been seeking without knowing it. His family and friends were puzzled, even dismayed, by his choice. Psychiatry in 1900 was not a respected field. It was the backwater of medicine, the domain of chronic cases locked away in asylums, patients deemed incurable and largely hopeless. The academic medicine of the day could offer little for mental illness, beyond classification and custodial care. But Jung saw possibility where others saw futility. He saw human beings whose inner worlds had overwhelmed them, who had become lost in the very labyrinths of the psyche that he himself had explored in dream and reverie. He would go to them, he decided, and try to understand their experiences from within, rather than merely observe them from without. In December 1900, Jung took up a position as an assistant physician at the Burghalsli Mental Hospital in Zurich, under the direction of Eugen Bleuler, one of the leading psychiatrists of the age. Bleuler was a humane and innovative clinician who believed that even the most disturbed patients could be reached through patient, empathetic engagement. The Burghalsli was a world unto itself, a large institution housing hundreds of patients suffering from what was then called dementia praecox, the early madness, which Bleuler would later rename schizophrenia, as well as manic depressive illness, psychotic episodes, and the various neuroses and psychoses that afflicted humanity. Jung immersed himself completely in this work. He lived at the hospital, spending long hours with patients, listening to their strange utterances, observing their symptoms, trying to understand what their apparent madness might be attempting to express. He was struck by the realization that what seemed like nonsense often contained symbolic meaning, that the bizarre delusions and hallucinations of psychotic patients were not merely random neural misfirings, but rather meaningful expressions of psychological conflicts and contents. A patient who believed she was the queen of heaven was not simply deluded, but was perhaps expressing something about her own need for dignity and recognition, her own identification with archetypal images of the divine feminine. During these early years at the Berkholzli, Jung also began his research into word associations, developing what would become known as the association test. This was a deceptively simple procedure. The examiner would read a list of words to the subject, and the subject was to respond as quickly as possible with the first word that came to mind. Jung measured the response time and noted any unusual reactions, hesitations, repetitions, emotional disturbances. What he discovered was that certain words would provoke significantly longer reaction times and emotional responses. These words, he realized, were touching on what he came to call complexes, clusters of emotionally charged associations organized around a particular theme or experience. For example, a patient who had suffered a traumatic experience involving fire might show a prolonged reaction time to words like heat, smoke, or burn. The delay and the emotional disturbance indicated that the word had activated a complex, a semi-autonomous pocket of psychic energy that disrupted the normal flow of consciousness. This was groundbreaking work. Jung had found a way to empirically demonstrate what had previously been merely theoretical: the existence of unconscious mental contents that exerted measurable effects on behavior and cognition. The word association test became a tool used not only in clinical settings, but also, later, in criminal investigation and other fields where the detection of hidden emotional responses was valuable. In 1903, Jung married Emma Rauschenbach, a young woman from a wealthy Swiss family. Emma was intelligent, thoughtful, and would become not only his wife, but also, in time, a collaborator in his psychological work and an analyst in her own right. The marriage provided Jung with financial security that freed him to pursue his research without constant worry about money. It also established the domestic foundation of his life. They would have 5 children together and remain married until Emma's death, more than 50 years later, though the marriage would weather storms and complexities that we shall encounter as our story unfolds. In these same years, Jung was reading the works of Sigmund Freud, the Viennese neurologist who had published his radical interpretation of dreams in 1899. Jung was excited by what he read. Here was another physician who took the unconscious seriously, who saw dreams not as meaningless noise, but as meaningful communications from the depths of the psyche, who recognized that neurotic symptoms were symbolic expressions of repressed conflicts. Jung saw his own work on complexes as complementary to Freud's theories of repression and the unconscious. In 1906, Jung sent Freud a copy of his recently published Studies in Word Association, and thus began a correspondence that would develop into one of the most significant and ultimately most painful relationships of Jung's life. When they finally met in person in March 1907 at Freud's apartment in Vienna, the two men talked for 13 hours straight. Jung was 31, Freud 50. For Jung, Freud represented a longed-for father figure, a mentor who understood the importance of the unconscious and who had the courage to explore sexuality and the darker aspects of human nature that polite society preferred to ignore. For Freud, Jung represented hope for the psychoanalytic movement. Jung was a Gentile in a field dominated by Jewish practitioners, a Swiss rather than a Viennese doctor, someone who could help psychoanalysis gain wider acceptance in the medical establishment. Moreover, Jung was clearly brilliant, ambitious, and deeply committed to the investigation of the unconscious. For several years, the relationship flourished. Freud came to regard Jung as his heir apparent, the crown prince of psychoanalysis, who would carry forward the work after Freud himself was gone. They corresponded regularly, sometimes daily, sharing cases and ideas, working out the implications of psychoanalytic theory together. Jung threw his considerable energy into the psychoanalytic cause, defending Freud's ideas in publications and professional gatherings, organizing the International Psychoanalytic Association, and serving as its first president. In 1909, the two men traveled together to the United States to lecture at Clark University in Massachusetts, a trip that brought psychoanalysis to American shores and marked a high point in their collaboration. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. Jung was never entirely comfortable with certain aspects of Freudian theory, particularly Freud's insistence on the primacy of sexual drives as the fundamental force shaping the psyche. While Jung agreed that sexuality was important, he felt Freud's theory was reductive, that it failed to account for spiritual and creative dimensions of human experience that could not be explained away as sublimated sexuality. Jung was also uncomfortable with what he perceived as Freud's dogmatism, his need to have his theories accepted without question, his tendency to treat deviation from orthodox psychoanalytic doctrine as resistance or neurosis. A crucial moment in their relationship came during their voyage to America in 1909. The two men passed time on the ship by analyzing each other's dreams. When Jung pressed Freud to provide more personal details about his life in order to interpret one of Freud's dreams properly, Freud refused, saying that he could not risk his authority. Jung was shocked, and he later wrote, deeply disappointed. In that moment, he said, Freud lost his authority for him entirely. A teacher or analyst who placed his own authority above the pursuit of truth, who privileged his position over genuine inquiry, had betrayed the very principle of self-examination that psychoanalysis claimed to represent. Over the following years, the break became inevitable. In 1912, Jung published his work, Symbols of Transformation, which reinterpreted the concept of libido, where Freud saw libido as essentially sexual energy that might be sublimated into other forms. Jung proposed a broader understanding of libido as general psychic energy, a life force that could manifest in many forms: sexual, creative, spiritual, intellectual. This was not merely a theoretical quibble. It represented a fundamentally different vision of human nature. For Jung, the psyche's deepest drive was not toward sexual satisfaction, but toward wholeness, toward the realization of the full potential of the self. The publication of Symbols of Transformation marked the point of no return. The correspondence between Jung and Freud became strained, then hostile. By 1913, they had ceased communication altogether. For Jung, the break was devastating. He had lost not only a mentor and intellectual companion, but also, to some extent, his sense of identity within the psychoanalytic movement he had helped to build. He resigned as president of the International Psychoanalytic Association and withdrew from organized psychoanalysis. At the age of 38, he found himself professionally isolated, cut off from many colleagues who sided with Freud, uncertain of his direction. But this outer crisis precipitated an inner one that would prove even more transformative. In the years following his break with Freud, roughly from 1913 to 1919, Jung underwent what he would later describe as his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner turmoil and exploration that threatened to overwhelm him, but ultimately provided the experiential foundation for all his subsequent work. He felt himself sliding toward the chaos that he had observed in his patients at the Burr-Hoseley, felt the structures of his ego identity loosening, felt strange images and impulses rising from the depths of his psyche. Rather than fleeing from this experience or trying to suppress it through sheer force of will, Jung made a fateful decision. He would actively engage with these contents, would allow the unconscious to express itself, would descend into his own underworld and attempt to return with knowledge. It was an immensely dangerous undertaking. He knew from his psychiatric work that the line between psychological exploration and psychotic breakdown was perilously thin, but he felt he had no choice. These images and impulses were rising whether he willed them or not. The only question was whether he would meet them consciously or be swept away by them. He began what he called active imagination, a technique he developed during this period. Unlike passive dreaming, active imagination involved a conscious decision to relax the ego's control and allow unconscious contents to emerge while maintaining enough awareness to engage with them, to ask them questions, to enter into dialogue. He would sit in his study or walk along the lake near his house in Küsnacht and allow images to arise. Sometimes he would paint them or draw them, giving them form on paper. Sometimes he would write out dialogues with the figures that appeared to him. One of his first experiences of this kind involved a persistent inner pressure, a feeling as though something were pushing up from below, demanding expression. He had a fantasy of descending into the earth, through layer after layer, until he reached a kind of underground cave. There he encountered various figures, including an old man named Elijah and a young woman named Salome, along with a black serpent. These figures seemed to have their own autonomy, their own perspectives. Jung engaged them in conversation, asking them who they were and what they wanted. Elijah represented something like wisdom or the prophetic capacity, while Salome represented blind passion or eros. The serpent was something more primitive still, an ancient, chthonic presence. As the months passed, Jung's inner explorations grew more intense. He experienced visions of catastrophe, of blood flowing over the land, of Europe drowned in destruction. These visions came to him in late 1913 and early 1914, and he feared he was going mad. Then, World War I broke out in August 1914, and Jung realized with a shock that his inner visions had been prophetic, that something in the collective psyche of Europe had been building toward catastrophic violence, and he had sensed it in his own depths. The war convinced him that the unconscious was not merely personal but collective, that there were layers of the psyche shared by all members of a culture or even all members of humanity. During these years, Jung kept a detailed record of his inner experiences in what would later be known as the Red Book, a large, leather-bound journal into which he transcribed his active imaginations in elegant calligraphy, illustrating them with paintings and mandalas. He regarded this work as a kind of inner documentary, a record of his journey through his own unconscious. The Red Book contains encounters with various archetypal figures, including a mysterious entity Jung called Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher and the horns of a bull. Philemon became a kind of inner teacher for Jung, a figure of wisdom who explained aspects of the psyche's nature that Jung himself did not consciously understand. One of the key insights that Philemon conveyed was that thoughts and images have their own life. that they are not merely products of the ego, but autonomous beings that dwell within the psyche. This was a radical and even disturbing notion for Jung at first, but it explained his experience of active imagination, where figures would say and do things that surprised him, that seemed to come from outside his conscious intention. The psyche, he came to understand, is inhabited by a multiplicity of beings, or at least by contents that can be personified, each with their own agenda and perspective. This period of confrontation with the unconscious was extraordinarily difficult for high planes, Jung. He struggled to maintain his outer life, his practice, his family, his professional responsibilities, while simultaneously navigating this inner storm. He developed certain practices to help him stay grounded. Every morning, no matter what turmoil he experienced inwardly, he would see his patients, forcing himself to focus on their concerns rather than his own. He also worked with his hands, building a miniature stone village on the shore of the lake, an activity that helped him feel connected to the earth and to simple, concrete reality. This was another important insight. When the psyche threatens to overwhelm consciousness with its contents, engagement with the physical world can serve as a lifeline, a way of remembering that there is a material reality outside the tempest of images. By the end of World War I, Jung began to emerge from the worst of his inner crisis. He had not been destroyed by the unconscious, but neither had he simply subdued it and re-established status quo. Instead, he had established a new relationship with it, had learned to respect its autonomy while maintaining the integrity of consciousness. This experience became the template for his understanding of the individuation process, the lifelong journey of integrating unconscious contents into consciousness in a way that transforms and enlarges the personality without dissolving its coherence. In the 1920s, Jung began to articulate the theoretical framework that had emerged from his confrontation with the unconscious. He introduced the concept of the collective unconscious, distinguishing it from Freud's personal unconscious. While the personal unconscious contained material from an individual's own life, forgotten memories, repressed desires, experiences not yet assimilated into consciousness, the collective unconscious contained universal patterns and images that did not derive from personal experience. These patterns, which Jung called archetypes, were the structural elements of the collective unconscious, the deep forms or templates that shaped human experience across cultures and throughout history. The concept of archetypes would become central to Jung's mature psychology. An archetype, in Jung's usage, is not a specific image, but rather a form or potential that gives rise to similar images across different cultures and individuals. It is like an invisible axis around which similar images cluster. For example, the mother archetype is not any particular image of a mother, but rather the deep psychological pattern of motherness that manifests in countless specific images. The personal mother, the goddess, the earth, the church, the ocean. Each culture and each individual will clothe the archetype in particular images drawn from their own experience, but the underlying form remains consistent. Jung identified a number of key archetypes that appear regularly in dreams, myths, and the psychotic fantasies of his patients. The shadow represents the dark side of the personality, the repressed and inferior aspects that the ego prefers not to acknowledge. Every person casts a shadow, Jung observed, and that shadow contains not only destructive impulses, but also vitality and creativity that the ego has rejected. Coming to terms with the shadow means acknowledging that we are capable of the very things we condemn in others, that the criminal and the saint share a common humanity. The anima and animus represent, respectively, the feminine aspect in men and the masculine aspect in women. In Jung's time, gender roles were more rigidly defined than in contemporary Western culture, and he saw in his male patients a certain quality of relatedness and emotional depth that was suppressed or undeveloped, while in his female patients he observed a capacity for assertiveness and logical thinking that was similarly unintegrated. The anima and animus served as bridges to the unconscious, personifications that could mediate between ego consciousness and the deeper layers of the psyche. Like all of Jung's concepts, these were grounded in observation of what actually appeared in dreams and fantasies. His patients regularly encounter figures of the opposite sex who seem to represent something within themselves. The self is perhaps the most important archetype in Jung's system, though also the most difficult to grasp conceptually. The self represents the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, the potential wholeness toward which the individuation process aims. It is distinct from and larger than the ego, which is merely the center of consciousness. The self is the center of the entire psyche, conscious and unconscious together. It often appears in dreams and visions as symbols of wholeness. The mandala, the divine child, the wise old man, the cosmic tree. The self is both what we are in our deepest nature and what we are striving to become through the integration of consciousness and the unconscious. Jung also spoke of complexes, expanding on his early word association research. A complex is a cluster of feelings, thoughts, and memories organized around a particular theme and possessing its own energy. Everyone has complexes: the mother complex, the father complex, the power complex, the inferiority complex. These are semi-autonomous pockets of psychic energy that can temporarily seize control of consciousness, causing us to react in ways that are disproportionate or irrational. When someone pushes our buttons, they are activating a complex. The complex then takes over, and we find ourselves responding not to the present situation, but to the archaic emotions and assumptions contained in the complex. The process of individuation, in Jung's psychology, is the central task of the second half of life. Individuation means becoming who one truly is, integrating the various aspects of the personality into a whole. It is not the same as individualism or mere self-assertion. Rather, it involves a dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, in which the ego learns to recognize and integrate contents that arise from the depths. This is a gradual process, often facilitated by dreams, by creative work, by relationships, and by the encounters with life that force us to confront aspects of ourselves we had not acknowledged. A central dynamic in individuation involves the reconciliation of opposites. The psyche, Jung observed, seems to be structured according to a principle of opposition. Consciousness calls forth its opposite in the unconscious. Development of one side creates compensation on the other. The extroverted conscious attitude is balanced by an introverted unconscious. An excessively rational persona evokes irrational moods from below. Individuation requires that these opposites be brought into relationship rather than keeping one suppressed. This does not mean eliminating the tension between them, but rather holding the tension consciously, allowing a third thing to emerge, what Jung called the transcendent function, a symbol or perspective that can encompass both sides of the opposition. For example, the relationship between persona and shadow is one such pair of opposites. The persona is the social mask, the identity we present to the world, the role we play in the collective. It is necessary and not inherently false, but it is partial. The shadow contains what the persona excludes. A person whose persona is all light and goodness will have a shadow full of darkness and transgression. Individuation requires acknowledging the shadow, bringing its contents into consciousness, and finding a more inclusive identity that can embrace both the acceptable and the unacceptable aspects of oneself. Similarly, the relationship between ego and self is a central axis of individuation. The ego, as the center of consciousness, tends to identify itself as the whole of the personality, but it is actually a small part, a fragment floating on the vast ocean of the unconscious. The self relativizes the ego, showing it that there is a greater wholeness of which it is a part. This realization can be deeply disturbing to the ego, which must relinquish its sense of absolute control. But it can also be liberating, relieving the ego of the burden of believing itself solely responsible for the psyche's contents and directions. The ego's task is not to become the self, but to establish a conscious relationship with the self, to serve as the aware participant in a process larger than itself. Jung devoted considerable attention to the study of symbols as the language through which the unconscious communicates. Unlike signs, which have a fixed, conventional meaning, symbols point towards something that cannot be fully articulated in rational discourse. A symbol participates in the mystery it represents: the cross, the mandala, the tree, the hero's journey. These are symbols that carry layers of meaning, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. Jung approached symbols with what he called a hermeneutic attitude, seeking to understand their meaning from multiple perspectives rather than reducing them to a single interpretation. Dreams, in particular, fascinated Jung throughout his life. Unlike Freud, who saw dreams primarily as disguised wish fulfillments, Jung understood dreams as direct communications from the unconscious, expressing in symbolic form the current state of the psyche and pointing toward directions of development. Dreams compensate the conscious attitude, providing what consciousness lacks. If one is too one-sided in waking life, the dream will present the other side. Dreams also have a perspective or teleological function, pointing forward toward possibilities of growth and integration. Jung developed a method of dream interpretation that respected the autonomy of the dream image rather than immediately translating it into theoretical concepts. He would ask the dreamer for associations, but he would also consider the image itself, attending to its archetypal resonances, its connections to myth and symbol. He might ask, where does this image appear in the world's mythologies? What stories contain this figure? What does this symbol mean in alchemy, in Gnosticism, in indigenous traditions? By amplifying the dream image through such comparative analysis, Jung sought to understand its full depth and implications. The practice of active imagination, which Jung had developed during his confrontation with the unconscious, became a central technique in his analytical work. He taught certain patients to engage in active imagination as a way of establishing direct dialogue with unconscious contents. The method required that one enter a state between sleeping and waking, relaxed but alert, and allow images to arise spontaneously. Rather than simply observing these images passively, as in a dream, the practitioner would engage with them, speak to the figures that appeared, ask them questions, even argue with them if necessary. Through this engagement, unconscious contents could be brought into relationship with consciousness, integrated rather than remaining split off and autonomous. During the 1920s and 30s, Jung also developed his theory of psychological types, seeking to understand the different ways that people orient themselves toward the world and process experience. He identified two basic attitudes, extroversion and introversion. The extrovert's energy flows outward toward objects and other people. The introvert's energy flows inward toward the subject's own internal states. These were not social categories, Jung emphasized, but deep orientations of the psyche's energy. He further identified four functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Thinking and feeling are rational or judging functions. They evaluate and assign value to experience. Sensation and intuition are irrational or perceiving functions. They simply register what is present. Each person, Jung observed, tends to develop one of these functions as their primary mode of engaging with the world. A thinking type relies primarily on logical analysis, a feeling type on value judgments and emotional response, a sensation type on concrete sensory data, and an intuitive type on hunches and possibilities beyond what is immediately evident. Moreover, Jung noted that the primary function tends to be in the person's conscious attitude if one is an extroverted thinking type. For instance, thinking is the most differentiated function and is directed outward toward the world. The opposite function in this case, introverted feeling, tends to be the least developed, the most unconscious, what Jung called the inferior function. This inferior function, precisely because it is unconscious and undifferentiated, often causes problems, erupting in primitive and autonomous ways. The highly rational person may be overwhelmed by irrational moods and feelings. The extremely feeling-oriented person may be possessed by harsh, critical thoughts. This typology was not meant to categorize people into boxes, but rather to understand the particular one-sidedness of consciousness and the compensatory dynamics in the unconscious. It became immensely influential, forming the basis for the Myers-Briggs type indicator and numerous other personality assessment tools, though Jung himself was ambivalent about such applications, fearing that the subtlety of his observations would be lost in oversimplified classifications. In the 1930s, Jung became increasingly interested in alchemy, the medieval practice of transmuting base metals into gold. At first glance, this might seem a strange preoccupation for a psychologist, but Jung came to see alchemy as a projected psychology, an unconscious symbolic system in which the alchemists were actually describing the transformation of the psyche, even as they thought they were working with material substances. The alchemical process of transforming lead into gold paralleled the psychological process of transforming the base, unconscious material of the shadow into the gold of conscious realization. The alchemical concept of the conjunction of opposites, the union of sun and moon, king and queen, sulfur and mercury, described the very process of individuation that Jung was attempting to articulate. Jung spent years studying alchemical texts, learning to read their strange, cryptic language. He collected rare alchemical manuscripts and treatises, compiling an extraordinary library of esoteric materials. His major work on the subject, Psychology and Alchemy, published in 1944, demonstrated through detailed analysis of alchemical symbolism and the dreams of his patients how the same archetypal images appeared in both contexts. The alchemical work was a kind of active imagination projected onto matter, a dialogue with the unconscious conducted through the medium of chemical operations. Another concept that emerged from Jung's mature work was synchronicity, which he defined as an acausal connecting principle. Jung had long been struck by meaningful coincidences, events that were connected not by cause and effect, but by meaning. A patient would dream of a scarab beetle, and at that moment, a scarab beetle would knock against the window of Jung's consulting room. Such occurrences happened too often to dismiss as mere chance, yet they had no causal explanation. Jung proposed that there might be a principle of connection in nature that operated through meaning rather than through physical causation. The psyche and world were not entirely separate, but participated in a common reality where inner and outer could mirror each other. This was a radical idea that brought Jung to the edge of psychology and into the realm of physics and philosophy. He corresponded with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli about synchronicity, exploring whether quantum mechanics might provide a framework for understanding such a causal correspondences. Pauli, who had his own interest in psychology and had been a patient of Jung's, saw intriguing parallels between the observer effect in quantum physics and the role of consciousness in synchronistic events. Though Jung's synchronicity concept remains controversial and outside the mainstream of academic psychology, it points toward his deeply held conviction that the psyche is not locked inside the skull, but participates in a larger reality. Throughout these decades of theoretical development, Jung maintained an active clinical practice. He saw patients from around the world, often for intensive periods of analysis. His consulting room in Küsnacht became a kind of pilgrimage site for those seeking psychological and spiritual guidance. Jung's approach to therapy was quite different from Freud's. He did not sit behind the patient as a blank screen, but rather met them face to face, as one human being to another. He brought his own personality into the room, understanding that the analyst's psyche and the patient's psyche were both active participants in the analytical relationship. Jung called this the transference and countertransference, though he understood these terms somewhat differently than Freud. For Jung, the therapeutic relationship was not primarily about the patient reenacting childhood patterns with the analyst, but rather about two psyches engaging in a mutual process that affected both. The analyst was not immune to being changed by the work. Jung insisted that analysts could take their patients no further than they had gone themselves, which is why the training of analysts required not just intellectual study, but deep personal work, ongoing confrontation with one's own unconscious. Jung's clinical stance was characterized by what might be called respect for the image. He did not rush to explain away the symbolic contents that appeared in dreams and fantasies, but rather allowed them to reveal their own meaning over time. He trusted in the teleology of the psyche, the purposiveness of unconscious processes. Symptoms and images, even apparently pathological ones, were understood as attempted solutions to psychological problems, the psyche's way of trying to communicate what consciousness had not grasped. The analyst's task was to help the patient understand this communication, to translate the symbolic language of the unconscious into terms that consciousness could engage with. This approach sometimes put Jung at odds with more medically oriented psychiatrists who sought to eliminate symptoms as efficiently as possible. Jung was not opposed to the relief of suffering, but he believed that too quick a removal of symptoms might deprive the person of important messages from the unconscious. A depression, for instance, might be the psyche's way of forcing a person to withdraw from an unsustainable external situation and turn inward to find new meaning. To simply medicate away the depression without addressing the underlying existential crisis would be to miss the opportunity for transformation. Jung's interest in religion and spirituality also deepened throughout his mature years. He traveled extensively, visiting indigenous peoples in Africa, India, and the American Southwest, observing their religious practices and mythologies. He was struck by the universality of certain symbols and themes: the Great Mother, the Wise Old Man, the hero's journey, the sacred center. He came to see religion not as an outmoded delusion, as Freud had regarded it, but as a fundamental expression of the human psyche's need for meaning and connection to something transcendent. At the same time, Jung was careful to distinguish between the psychological and the metaphysical. He claimed to approach religion as a psychologist, not as a theologian. He did not assert whether God existed in a metaphysical sense, but rather observed that the archetype of God, the image of the divine, was a psychological fact, appearing spontaneously in dreams and visions, even in people who had no conscious religious belief. The psyche seemed to have an innate religious function, a drive toward wholeness and meaning that expressed itself in numinous images. The numinous, a term Jung borrowed from the theologian Rudolf Otto, refers to the quality of experience that evokes awe, mystery, and a sense of the holy other. Numinous experiences, whether through religion, nature, art, or love, put one in touch with the archetypal dimension of existence, the level where the personal opens onto the transpersonal. Jung saw the atrophy of religious life in modern Western culture as a kind of spiritual crisis, leaving people without adequate containers for numinous experience, without rituals and symbols to mediate between ego and self. One of Jung's most controversial works was Answer to Job, published in 1952. In this book, Jung offered a psychological interpretation of the Book of Job, exploring the dark side of the God image. In the biblical story, God allows Satan to torment Job, a righteous man, as a test. Jung was disturbed by the morality of this story and saw in it evidence of the unconscious, amoral nature of the deity as portrayed. Job, Jung argued, is more conscious than Yahweh. Through his suffering and his refusal to accept easy answers, Job demands that God become more conscious. The incarnation of Christ, Jung suggested, could be understood as God's response to Job's challenge, an attempt by the divine to experience and integrate its own shadow through becoming human and suffering. This reading shocked many religious readers, who saw it as heretical. Jung was not trying to make theological claims, he insisted, but rather to read the texts psychologically, to understand what they revealed about the human experience of the divine. The God image in the psyche was ambivalent, containing both light and dark, both creation and destruction. Any adequate spirituality, Jung believed, needed to acknowledge this totality rather than splitting the divine into absolute good and projecting all evil onto a separate devil. In his old age, Jung continued to write and see select patients. He built a tower at Bollingen on the upper lake of Zurich, a stone structure that he expanded and modified over the decades. This tower became a kind of laboratory for his inner work, a place removed from the modern world where he could engage in active imagination, carve stone, and contemplate the mysteries he had spent his life exploring. The tower had no electricity, no running water. Jung wanted to live there in a simpler way, closer to the medieval consciousness that had produced alchemy and the cathedrals. Jung's personal life was complex and at times troubled. His relationship with Emma, his wife, endured but was tested by his long relationship with Tony Wolff, a former patient who became his mistress and close collaborator. This triangle caused considerable pain, particularly to Emma, yet it also seemed to express something of Jung's psychology of opposites and his belief that conventional morality could not always contain the demands of the individuating psyche. Emma eventually made her peace with the situation, developing her own work on the Grail legend and the nature of the feminine. The arrangement, whatever its ethical complexities, reflected Jung's conviction that consciousness requires holding tension rather than resolving it too quickly into comfortable categories. Jung's relationship with his children was also complicated. He was a demanding father, sometimes more present to his patients and his work than to his family. His children grew up in the shadow of a famous father whose theories about the psyche seemed to leave little room for ordinariness. Some of his children entered psychology or related fields. Others moved as far from it as possible. Jung himself seemed aware that he had lived a life driven by inner necessity, that he had followed his daemon, and that this had costs for those around him. As World War II approached, Jung's writings and statements about the German psyche became controversial. In the early 1930s, he had written about the difference between the Germanic unconscious and the Jewish unconscious, observations that were later used by Nazi propagandists, even though Jung's own position was anti-Nazi. Jung was trying to understand the psychological forces that had led to the rise of Hitler, seeing in Nazism an eruption of the Germanic shadow, the ancient god Wotan rising from the depths to possess an entire people. But his attempts to articulate these ideas in psychological terms were easily misconstrued and have remained a point of contention among Jung scholars. Was he engaging in a dangerous essentialism, or was he attempting a psychological diagnosis of a collective psychosis? Jung was not a systematic thinker in the sense that Freud was. He did not build a tightly integrated theoretical structure, but rather circled around the mystery of the psyche from many angles, using different terms and frameworks depending on the context. This has made his work both rich and difficult, open to many interpretations, but also sometimes frustratingly imprecise. His writing style, especially in his later work, is dense and elusive, requiring the reader to have familiarity with alchemy, Gnosticism, mythology, and other esoteric traditions. He seemed to write not for a general audience, but for those who had already undertaken inner work themselves and could recognize from their own experience the realities he was attempting to describe. In 1944, Jung suffered a heart attack that brought him close to death. During this crisis, he had a series of visions that were extraordinarily vivid, more real, he said, than ordinary waking life. He experienced himself floating in space above the earth, seeing the planet below as a luminous sphere. He approached a temple carved out of a meteorite, about to enter and discover the meaning of his life, when he saw his doctor approaching in the form of a primal image, and he knew that it was not yet his time. The doctor seemed to be saying that Jung must return to his body, that there was still work to be done. These near-death visions profoundly affected Jung's understanding of the psyche and its relationship to what lies beyond death. He became even more convinced that the psyche was not merely a product of the brain, but rather participated in a larger, perhaps eternal reality. The images he had experienced during this crisis had a quality different from either dreams or awakened consciousness, a clarity, a numinosity, a sense of absolute reality that suggested to him that consciousness might continue in some form beyond physical death. Jung recovered from his heart attack and lived another 17 years, though his health was never as robust as it had been. He continued to write, producing some of his most profound work in these final years, including Aion, which explored the self through the symbol of Christ and the Antichrist, and Mysterium Coniunctionis, his final and most comprehensive work on alchemy and the symbolic process of individuation. These late works are demanding and enigmatic, the fruits of a lifetime's engagement with the unconscious distilled into dense, symbol-laden prose. Carl Jung died on June 6, 1961, at his home in Küsnacht. He was 85 years old. 3 days before his death, he was still working, writing letters and notes. He died as he had lived, engaged with the mystery, trying to articulate what he had seen in the depths. His wife Emma had died several years earlier, in 1955, and Jung had mourned her deeply, feeling her loss as the severing of a connection that has sustained him throughout his adult life. In the years since his death, Jung's influence has spread far beyond the consulting room. His concepts have entered popular culture, sometimes in simplified or distorted forms. The archetype, the shadow, the collective unconscious, these terms are now used widely, often without full understanding of their original meaning. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, based on Jung's typology, has become one of the most widely used personality assessments in the world, though Jung himself will likely have been ambivalent about reducing his observations to a simple questionnaire. In academic psychology, Jung's work has been marginalized, seen as unscientific, too speculative, too willing to embrace mystical and spiritual dimensions that empirical psychology prefers to avoid. Jung is not taught in most mainstream psychology programs except as a historical curiosity, a road not taken. His emphasis on meaning, symbol, and the teleology of the psyche does not fit easily into the methodologies that dominate contemporary psychological research. Yet in other fields, Jung's influence remains vital. In literary criticism and the study of mythology, Jungian concepts provide powerful tools for understanding the recurring patterns in stories across cultures. In religious studies, Jung's work offers a psychological framework for understanding religious experience without either dismissing it as delusion or accepting it on faith. In the arts, especially in-depth psychology-oriented circles, Jung's ideas about the creative process and the relationship between the personal and the collective unconscious continue to inspire. Moreover, in the world of psychotherapy, Jung's legacy endures through Jungian analysts and analytically oriented therapists who practice around the world. The Jungian approach offers something that many people seeking therapy desire but cannot find in more symptom-focused treatments: attention to meaning, respect for the inner life, a Dodd sense that psychological work is not merely about adjustment, but about transformation and the realization of one's unique potential. Critics of Jung have raised various concerns. Some point to the lack of empirical validation for concepts like the collective unconscious and archetypes. How can we test whether there truly is a layer of the psyche inherited from our ancestors, containing universal images and patterns? Jung's response would likely be that the empirical evidence is in the dreams and fantasies of individuals, in the recurring motifs in myths worldwide, in the spontaneous appearance of symbols in psychotic episodes and in children's drawings. But this kind of evidence does not satisfy those who demand controlled experiments and quantifiable results. Others critique Jung's approach to gender, particularly his concepts of anima and animus. In positing a feminine element in men and a masculine element in women, does Jung not reinforce essentialist categories that feminist thinkers have worked to dismantle? Jung's defenders argue that he was describing psychological realities as he observed them in his patients, not making prescriptive statements about how men and women should be. Moreover, the anima and animus might be understood as cultural constructs, the internalization of gender expectations that then become autonomous psychological factors. But the debate continues, with some seeing Jung's gender concepts as products of his time that need revision, and others arguing they point to something deeper than cultural construction. The question of Jung's relationship to spirituality and religion also generates controversy. Was he a psychologist who respected religious experience, or was he a crypto-mystic who smuggled spiritual beliefs into psychology under the guise of empirical observation? Jung himself insisted he was approaching religious phenomena psychologically, studying the God image as a psychological fact without making claims about metaphysical realities. But his writing often seems to suggest more than this, to point toward a vision of the psyche as participating in a larger cosmic order, toward an implicit spiritual worldview. What cannot be denied is that Jung spoke to something many people experience, but that much of modern psychology ignores: the longing for meaning, the sense of being connected to something larger than oneself, the feeling that dreams and symbols carry messages worth attending to, the intuition that the psyche has depths that purely materialist explanations cannot account for. In a world increasingly dominated by technological rationality and economic instrumentalism, Jung's psychology offers an alternative vision, one in which the inner life matters, in which the soul that word Jung was not afraid to use has its own reality and its own demands. Let us now turn more deeply into the concepts and frameworks that emerged from Jung's extraordinary life, exploring with a slowness and care they deserve the architecture of his vision of the human psyche. The collective unconscious stands as perhaps Jung's most radical contribution to psychology, the idea that most clearly sets his work apart from Freud's and from the mainstream of psychological thought. To understand what Jung meant by this term, we must first distinguish it from the personal unconscious. The personal unconscious contains all the material from one's own life that is not currently in consciousness, but can potentially become conscious. Forgotten memories, repressed emotions, undeveloped potentials, experiences that never fully registered. All of this belongs to the personal unconscious. It is unique to each individual, shaped by their particular history and experience. The collective unconscious, by contrast, is not personal. It is the deepest layer of the psyche, inherited rather than acquired, universal rather than individual. Jung proposed that just as we inherit a human body with characteristic structures, a heart with 4 chambers, a brain with particular regions and capacities, we also inherit a psychic structure, templates or patterns that predispose us to experience and organize reality in certain ways. These inherited patterns are the archetypes. An archetype itself, Jung emphasized, is not an image, but rather a form or potential that gives rise to images. It is like the axial system of a crystal, which determines the pattern of crystallization without being itself visible. The archetype as such is empty, unrepresentable, but it shapes the way content is constellated and perceived. When it manifests in consciousness, it clothes itself in the images available from personal and cultural experience. Consider the mother archetype. Every human being has or had a mother, and the experience of being mothered is a human universal, varying in its particulars but constant in its essentials. The infant's relationship to the mother involves nourishment, protection, warmth, the first experience of otherness and relationship. This experience is so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the human condition, that it has created a psychic template, a predisposition to perceive mother-like qualities in certain contexts. The archetype of the mother is activated not only by the personal mother, but by any situation or symbol that evokes maternal qualities. The earth, the ocean, the church, the nation, a vessel or container, darkness and enclosure. The womb. In dreams and myths, the mother archetype can appear in countless forms. The loving mother, the terrible mother who devours her children, the virgin, the witch, the goddess. Each culture will embody this archetype in its own particular images. Demeter, Kali, the Virgin Mary, the Earth Mother. But the underlying pattern remains constant. Jung collected examples of such mother symbols from cultures around the world, demonstrating that even in cultures with no historical contact, the same essential themes appeared. The archetype, then, is both biological and psychological. It has its roots in the evolutionary history of the species, in the fundamental experiences that have shaped human consciousness over millennia. The infant's dependence on the mother, the human need for shelter and protection, the mystery of birth. These are experiences so primal and universal that they have left traces in the structure of the psyche itself. At the same time, the archetype is psychological, manifesting in images and emotions, shaping perception and behavior in ways that can be observed and studied. The shadow represents another crucial archetype, one that Jung explored extensively in his own work and in his clinical practice. The shadow is the rejected aspect of the personality, everything that the ego does not wish to acknowledge about itself. It contains characteristics and impulses that do not fit with the self-image one wants to maintain. For a person who sees themselves as kind and gentle, the shadow will contain aggression and cruelty. For someone who prides themselves on rationality, the shadow will harbor irrationality and instinct. The shadow is personal in its content, shaped by what each individual's consciousness has rejected. But the shadow itself, as a structural feature of the psyche, is archetypal. Every consciousness casts a shadow. This is inevitable. The formation of an ego identity, of a sense of I am this, necessarily involves exclusion. I am not that. What is excluded does not disappear, but falls into the shadow, where it continues to exist autonomously, often appearing in dreams as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer, but with threatening or disturbing qualities. Jung insisted that the shadow is not purely negative. It contains vitality and spontaneity that an overly controlled ego has suppressed. The shadow may hold creativity, passion, authenticity, all the life that has been sacrificed for the sake of social acceptability or a too narrow ideal of goodness. Integrating the shadow does not mean acting out every impulse it contains, but rather acknowledging these aspects of oneself, bringing them into consciousness where they can be related to rather than acting autonomously. The process of shadow integration is morally complex. It means admitting that one is capable of evil, that the potential for cruelty, deception, and destruction exists within. This is a humbling and often painful realization, but it is also liberating because it frees one from the exhausting effort of maintaining a purely good self-image and from the compulsion to project one's darkness onto others. Jung observed that we tend to see our own shadow traits in other people, to be most bothered by qualities in others that we have not acknowledged in ourselves. The person who is quick to condemn greed in others may be blind to their own avarice. The one who rails against sexual immorality may be suppressing their own desires. In the world of politics and collective life, the shadow also plays a crucial role. Groups, nations, and cultures have collective shadows, the traits and aspects of their heritage that they prefer not to acknowledge. These collective shadows are often projected onto other groups, creating enemies and justifying violence. The civilized nation sees itself as enlightened and rational, while projecting barbarism onto the foreign other. The religious group sees itself as righteous, while projecting evil onto heretics and unbelievers. Jung saw the horrors of the 20th century, the world wars, the genocides, the totalitarian movements as massive eruptions of the collective shadow, the return of what had been suppressed and denied. The anima and animus represent the contrasexual archetypes, the feminine in men and the masculine in women. Jung developed these concepts through observation of his patients' dreams and fantasies. He noticed that men would often dream of female figures who represented something in themselves, not an external woman but an inner feminine presence. This inner figure, the anima, served as a mediator between the ego and the unconscious. She appeared in many forms: the seductress, the spiritual guide, the soulmate, the muse, the femme fatale. Each form represented a different stage or aspect of a man's relationship to his own unconscious. Jung traced a developmental sequence in the anima, from the primitive biological anima represented by Eve to the romantic and aesthetic anima represented by Helen of Troy, to the spiritual anima represented by the Virgin Mary, to the highest level, Sophia or wisdom, a guide to transcendent meaning. A man's relationship with actual women would be colored by the state of his anima. If the anima was unconscious and undeveloped, he might project it wholesale onto women, seeing them not as individuals but as embodiments of his own inner image, leading to disappointment and misunderstanding when the real woman inevitably failed to match the projection. The animus in women functioned similarly, but with different qualities. Where the anima tended to be a singular, unified figure, the animus often appeared as a plurality, a council of judges or opinion makers. The animus represented the woman's capacity for logos, for rational thought and assertion, qualities that in Jung's time were culturally coded as masculine. An unconscious animus might manifest as rigid opinions, harsh judgments, or a kind of psychological possession by convictions, not really one's own, but absorbed from external authorities. Modern readers often find Jung's anima and animus concepts problematic, seeing in them outdated gender stereotypes. Jung was writing in a time when gender roles were more strictly defined, and his observations reflected the psychological reality of his patients in that historical moment. Whether the contrasexual archetype is a universal feature of the psyche or a historically contingent phenomenon remains a matter of debate. Some contemporary Jungians have attempted to revise these concepts, understanding them as referring not to gender per se, but to the relationship between dominant conscious attitudes and compensatory unconscious contents. The conversation continues, an example of how Jung's ideas remain living and contested rather than settled doctrine. The self, the archetype of wholeness, represents the goal and meaning of the individuation process. Jung distinguished the self from the ego carefully. The ego is the center of consciousness, the I that thinks and perceives and makes decisions. It is essential but limited, a small circle of awareness within the vast expanse of the psyche. The self is the center of the total psyche, conscious and unconscious together. It is both the source from which the ego emerges and the goal toward which development moves. In dreams and visions, the self often appears in symbols of totality. The mandala, a circle divided into 4 quarters, the divine child, representing potential and new beginning, the wise old man or woman, representing accumulated wisdom, the sacred center, the temple or garden or mountain where opposites meet. Jung observed that mandala images appeared spontaneously in the dreams of his patients during times of psychological crisis, as though the psyche were spontaneously generating symbols of wholeness to compensate for the sense of fragmentation in consciousness. The relationship between ego and self is paradoxical. The ego is produced by the self, differentiated out of the larger wholeness of the psyche. Yet the ego is also necessary for the self to become conscious. Without an ego, there is only potential, only the undifferentiated unity of the unconscious. The self needs the ego as the organ of consciousness, the place where the contents of the unconscious can become known. At the same time, the ego needs to recognize that it is not the whole, that it serves a greater totality. This recognition often comes as a crisis. The ego's inflation, its belief in its own centrality and control, must be punctured. This can happen through suffering, through failure, through encounter with forces beyond the ego's management. Depression, for instance, might be understood as the self forcing the ego to withdraw from its external involvements and turn inward. The heroic ego, which believes it can master life through will and effort, must learn humility before the self, must learn to listen and to serve rather than to command. Yet the ego also has its rights and its necessity. Jung was critical of certain Eastern approaches to consciousness that seemed to him to aim at dissolving the ego entirely, returning to an undifferentiated unity. For Jung, the goal was not to eliminate the ego, but to establish right relationship between ego and self, a relationship in which the ego maintains its integrity and function while recognizing its place within a larger whole. This is the balance that individuation seeks, consciousness that includes awareness of the unconscious, a centered personality that contains and relates the opposites rather than identifying with one pole and suppressing the other. The process of individuation, which Jung saw as the central task of psychological development, especially in the second half of life, is not a linear progression, but rather a spiraling, deepening, a continual cycle of disintegration and reintegration at higher levels of complexity. It typically begins with some disruption of the status quo, some challenge to the persona and the adapted personality. This might come through a life crisis, the loss of a job, the end of a relationship, an illness, the death of a loved one. It might come through a dream or series of dreams that cannot be assimilated into the existing self-understanding. It might come through an encounter with someone or something that constellates unconscious contents, activating complexes or archetypes that demand attention. The first stage often involves encountering the shadow. One begins to see aspects of oneself that have been denied or projected. This can be deeply unsettling, calling into question the identity one has constructed. If I am not simply the good person I thought I was, if I contain darkness and selfishness and capacity for harm, then who am I? This question initiates a deeper inquiry into the nature of the self. As the shadow is integrated, at least partially, for the work is never complete, the shadow continually reforms attention, often turns to the contrasexual archetype, the anima or animus. One begins to develop qualities that had been dormant or projected onto others. A man might discover his capacity for relatedness, emotional depth, receptivity. A woman might discover her capacity for assertion, intellectual clarity, independence. These developments change the way one relates to others and to oneself, bringing greater wholeness but also greater complexity. Throughout this process, dreams serve as guides, commentaries, warnings, and encouragements from the unconscious. Jung taught his patients to record their dreams, to reflect on them, to paint or draw the images that appeared. He encouraged active imagination as a way of engaging with the figures and symbols that appeared. Through these practices, a dialogue develops between consciousness and the unconscious, each influencing the other, gradually transforming the personality. Jung emphasized that individuation is not self-improvement in the conventional sense. It is not about becoming perfect or successful or even happy, though happiness may come as a byproduct. It is about becoming whole, which includes acknowledging and integrating aspects of oneself that are difficult or painful. It is about discovering and living one's unique truth, rather than conforming to collective expectations. This often places the individuating person at odds with collective values and norms, which tend toward uniformity and conventional adaptation. The individuating person may appear strange or difficult to others. They may make choices that seem inexplicable from an external point of view, because those choices arise from inner necessity rather than outer logic. Jung himself exemplified his life choices. His willingness to explore seemingly bizarre symbolic material, his long confrontation with the unconscious, all set him apart from the conventional path of medical and academic success. Yet, individuation is not mere eccentricity or self-indulgence. The individuating person is following a call, responding to something that feels more real and more necessary than social approval. There is a quality of fate or destiny to it, a sense that one must follow this path regardless of the costs. Jung used the term vocation to describe this, in its original sense of being called. The individuating person is called by the self, summoned, to the work of becoming who they actually are, beneath the layers of persona and social conditioning. Jung's understanding of dreams deserves particular attention, for it represents a significant departure from both Freud's approach and from the dismissive attitude of mainstream psychology. For Jung, dreams are not primarily disguises for unconscious wishes, but rather direct, symbolic communications from the unconscious. The dream presents itself in the language of symbol and image, because that is the natural language of the unconscious, not because it is trying to evade censorship. The dream compensates the conscious attitude. If consciousness is too one-sided, too identified with a particular perspective or way of being, the dream will present the other side. A person who is excessively rational and controlled in waking life may dream of wild, chaotic situations. A person who is overly passive may dream of aggression and assertion. The dream seeks to restore balance, to bring what is lacking in consciousness. Dreams also have a prospective function. They point forward to potential developments, to directions the psyche wants to move. A dream might present an image of something that does not yet exist in the dreamer's life, but that represents a possibility seeking to emerge. Jung did not interpret such dreams as predictive of external events, but rather as indicating the direction of psychological growth. In his approach to dream interpretation, Jung began by gathering the dreamer's associations to the dream elements, but did not stop there. He also considered the archetypal dimension of the images. Where does this symbol appear in mythology, in religion, in the world's symbolic traditions? What is the universal, collective aspect of this image? By amplifying the dream through such comparative material, Jung sought to understand both its personal meaning for the dreamer and its rootedness in the collective unconscious. Jung was also attentive to dream series, rather than focusing only on individual dreams. A series of dreams over weeks or months might show a development, a progressive movement of the psyche towards some realization or integration. Certain images might appear repeatedly, becoming more differentiated over time, suggesting that the unconscious is working on a particular theme or problem. One of Jung's most famous dream analyses involved a long series of dreams from a patient he called the physicist, actually Wolfgang Pauli. Jung published an extensive study of these dreams, showing how the dreamer's psyche worked through various stages of development, how symbols of the self gradually emerged, how the quaternio, or fourfold structure, appeared in multiple forms, pointing toward wholeness. The analysis demonstrated Jung's method in action, his patient attention to symbol and image, his willingness to let the material speak rather than imposing a predetermined interpretive framework. Active imagination, which we have touched on earlier, deserves fuller exploration. This technique represented one of Jung's most original contributions to therapeutic practice. It is a method of consciously engaging with the unconscious, a way of creating a waking encounter with autonomous psychic contents. Active imagination differs from both free association and passive fantasy. In free association, one simply reports whatever comes to mind without direction. In passive fantasy, one allows images to arise but does not engage with them. Active imagination involves a deliberate relaxation of ego control to allow images to emerge, followed by conscious engagement with those images. The practice typically begins by focusing attention inward and allowing the mind to become receptive. One might start with an image from a dream, or simply wait for an image to arise spontaneously. When an image appears, a figure, a landscape, a symbol, one observes it carefully, noting its qualities. Then, crucially, one enters into dialogue with it. If a figure appears, one might ask who they are, what they want, what they have to say. The practitioner maintains consciousness throughout, remaining aware that this is an exercise of imagination, but takes the images seriously as expressions of unconscious contents. What happens in active imagination often surprises the practitioner. The figures and images behave autonomously, saying and doing things that the ego did not consciously intend. A figure might offer advice, make demands, reveal information that the conscious mind did not know. This autonomy is evidence of the reality of unconscious processes, of the multiplicity that exists within the psyche. Through repeated practice of active imagination, one can develop relationships with these inner figures, coming to understand what they represent and what they need from consciousness. Jung emphasized that active imagination is not without risks. It involves loosening the boundaries of the ego and allowing unconscious contents to become activated. For someone with weak ego structure or a tendency toward dissociation, this could be destabilizing. Jung recommended that active imagination be practiced only with the guidance of an analyst, at least initially, and that it be balanced with grounding in external reality through work, relationships, and physical activity. The process of active imagination could take various forms. Some people would conduct it as an inner dialogue, writing out the conversation between themselves and the figure that appeared. Others would paint or draw the images. Still others would engage in movement or dance, allowing the body to express what was emerging from the unconscious. Jung himself used multiple modalities, writing, painting, and stone carving in his own active imagination practice. The goal of active imagination is not entertainment or mere curiosity, but rather integration. Through engaging with unconscious contents consciously, through bringing them into relationship with the ego, one gradually integrates what had been split off, or autonomous. A threatening shadow figure, once engaged in dialogue, might reveal itself to be not as terrible as it seemed, or might make its needs known in a way that allows for some accommodation. An anima figure might evolve from a seductive or destructive presence into a helpful guide. Through this work, the personality becomes more whole, less fragmented, as consciousness and the unconscious come into productive relationship. Jung's typology, his theory of psychological types, emerged from his observations of the different ways people orient themselves in the world. He noticed that people seemed to fall into recognizable patterns in how they engaged with experience, patterns that were consistent over time and across situations. This was not a matter of social conditioning, Jung felt, but rather reflected something about the innate structure of the psyche. The most fundamental distinction in Jung's typology is between extraversion and introversion. These terms have entered common language but are often misunderstood. In popular usage, extraversion is equated with sociability and introversion with shyness. For Jung, these terms describe the direction of psychic energy. The extrovert's libido flows outward, toward objects and other people. The extrovert is energized by interaction with the external world, finds interest and value in the object. The introvert's libido flows inward, toward the subject's own internal states. The introvert is energized by solitude and internal processing, finds interest and value in subjective experience and reflection. Neither attitude is superior to the other. Each has its strengths and limitations. The extrovert can engage the world dynamically, responding quickly to changing circumstances, relating easily to others. But the extrovert may lack depth of inner life, may be dependent on external stimulation and validation, may not develop rich internal resources. The introvert can go deep into ideas and experiences, can maintain independence from collective opinion, can develop profound insights. But the introvert may be awkward in social situations, may be cut off from the vitality of immediate experience, may become lost in abstraction. Moreover, Jung observed that the attitude one identifies with consciously is compensated by the opposite attitude in the unconscious. The conscious extrovert will have an introverted unconscious, which may appear in moods of withdrawal or in attraction to introverted partners. The conscious introvert will have an extroverted unconscious, which may appear in sudden impulses toward wild social engagement or in projection of extroverted qualities onto others. Jung's four functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, add another layer of complexity. Each function represents a different way of apprehending and evaluating reality. Thinking evaluates through logic and analysis, asking, is this true or false? Feeling evaluates through value and preference, asking, is this good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant? Sensation perceives through the senses, registering what is concretely present. Intuition perceives through the unconscious, grasping possibilities and meanings that are not immediately evident. Thinking and feeling are rational functions, in that they involve judgment and evaluation. Sensation and intuition are irrational functions, in that they involve perception without judgment. Jung emphasized that irrational does not mean crazy, but rather means not based on rational principles, operating according to their own logic. Each person, Jung observed, tends to develop one of these functions as their primary or superior function. This is the function they rely on most, that is, most differentiated and conscious. If thinking is one's superior function, one will approach problems primarily through analysis and logic. If feeling is superior, one will approach them primarily through evaluation of their impact on values and relationships. If sensation is superior, one will be highly attuned to concrete, present detail. If intuition is superior, one will be most interested in possibilities and underlying meanings. The function opposite to the superior function tends to be the inferior function, the least developed and most unconscious. For the thinking type, feeling is inferior. For the sensation type, intuition is inferior. The inferior function operates in a primitive, undifferentiated way, often causing problems precisely because it is unconscious and clumsy. The highly rational thinker may be possessed by childish, unreasonable emotional reactions. The highly intuitive person may be remarkably incompetent with practical, concrete matters. Jung combined these two dimensions, the attitudes, extroversion, and introversion, and the functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, to create 8 basic types: extroverted, thinking, introverted thinking, extroverted feeling, introverted feeling, extroverted sensation, introverted sensation, extroverted intuition, and introverted intuition. Each type has a characteristic way of being in the world, characteristic strengths and weaknesses, characteristic blind spots. For example, the introverted thinking type lives primarily in a world of ideas and logical analysis, oriented toward understanding systems and principles. They can be brilliant theoreticians, but may struggle with emotional relationships and may be impractical in everyday life. The extroverted feeling type, by contrast, is highly attuned to social atmosphere and to others' needs and values, excellent at creating harmony and connection, but may lack strong individual opinions and may be overly dependent on others' approval. Jung emphasized that these types are not boxes to put people in, but rather tools for understanding the particular one-sidedness of consciousness and the compensatory dynamics in the unconscious. No one is a pure type. Each person has access to all the functions, but they are developed to different degrees. The task of individuation includes developing the inferior function at least somewhat, integrating it into consciousness so that it does not operate entirely autonomously and primitively. The typology also has clinical significance. Jung observed that analysts tended to interpret patients through the lens of their own type, seeing others as operating according to the same psychological laws they themselves experienced. An analyst of thinking type might overemphasize rational insight and undervalue emotional experience. An analyst of feeling type might focus too much on relationship dynamics and miss important logical contradictions. Knowing one's type can help the analyst recognize their own biases and relate more effectively to patients of different types. After Jung's death, Isabel Myers and Catherine Briggs developed the Myers-Briggs type indicator, adding a fourth dimension, judging versus perceiving, to Jung's typology and creating a 16-type system. The MBTI became enormously popular, used in business, education, and personal development. Jung's original typology was subtler and more fluid than the MBTI suggests, but the influence is undeniable. Whether this popularization has helped or hindered understanding of Jung's actual ideas is a matter of ongoing debate. Jung's engagement with alchemy represents one of the most unusual and fascinating aspects of his mature work. When Jung first encountered alchemical texts in the 1920s, they seemed to be incomprehensible gibberish. Elaborate descriptions of chemical procedures mixed with mystical symbolism and religious imagery. Alchemists spoke of transforming base metals into gold through a series of operations: calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, coagulation, that involved mysterious substances like the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. Most historians of science treated alchemy as primitive chemistry, a misguided attempt at metallurgy mixed with superstition. But Jung came to see something else in alchemy. He recognized in the alchemical images and processes the same symbols that appeared in his patients' dreams. The alchemical work of transforming lead into gold paralleled the psychological work of transforming unconscious, base contents into conscious realization. The alchemical marriage of sun and moon, king and queen, sulfur and mercury represented the union of opposites that occurs in individuation. The alchemists, Jung concluded, were unknowingly engaged in projection. They saw their own psychic processes mirrored in the behavior of chemical substances. This does not mean the alchemists were consciously doing psychology. They genuinely believed they were working with matter, that they would achieve physical transformation of substances. But the depth of their engagement, the religious seriousness with which they approached the work, the richness of the symbolism they employed, all indicated that something more than chemistry was happening. The alchemist would spend years on the work, observing the transformations in the alembic, meditating on the colors and forms that appeared, recording dreams and visions that arose during the process. It was a spiritual practice as much as a chemical investigation. Jung identified numerous parallels between alchemical stages and psychological development. The nigredo, or blackening, in alchemy corresponds to the encounter with the shadow, the dark, putrefying stage where the old identity breaks down. The albedo, or whitening, represents purification, the separation of elements that had been confused. The rubedo, or reddening, represents the final stage where a new synthesis is achieved. Throughout the process, the adept must tend the fire carefully, maintaining just the right temperature, neither too hot nor too cold, a metaphor for the precise attention. Consciousness must pay to the unconscious contents as they transform. The philosopher's stone, the legendary goal of alchemy, was described as a paradoxical substance, both one and many, matter and spirit, beginning and end. Jung saw in the philosopher's stone a symbol of the self, the goal of individuation that is also somehow present from the beginning, the wholeness that we seek, but that also seeks us. The alchemist said that the stone was found everywhere, despised and rejected, cast into the street, a description that applies to the unconscious, which is everywhere present but ignored by ego consciousness. Jung's study of alchemy was not merely academic. He found in the alchemical texts a confirmation of his own psychology, a historical tradition that had been grappling with the same realities he was attempting to articulate. Moreover, alchemy provided him with a rich symbolic vocabulary, images that helped him express aspects of psychic transformation that were difficult to describe in more conventional psychological language. His major works on alchemy, particularly Psychology and Alchemy and Mysterium Conjunctionis, are dense and difficult, but represent the fullest expression of his understanding of the individuation process as a symbolic opus, a great work. The concept of synchronicity emerged from Jung's long reflection on meaningful coincidences. Throughout his life, Jung had experienced events that seemed to be connected by meaning rather than by causality. A patient would be describing a dream about a particular animal, and at that moment, that animal would appear outside the window. Someone would be thinking intensely about a person they had not seen in years, and that person would suddenly telephone. These events happened too often, and with too much significance, to be dismissed as mere chance, yet they had no causal explanation. There was no physical mechanism by which the thought caused the telephone call, or the dream caused the animal's appearance. Jung proposed that, in addition to causality, which connects events through chains of cause and effect in time, there might be another principle at work in nature, and a causal connecting principle that operates through meaning. He called this synchronicity. A synchronistic event is one in which an inner state, a thought, feeling, dream, or intuition, and an outer event correspond meaningfully, without one causing the other. The connection is not temporal or spatial, but symbolic. Jung suggested that synchronicity reveals the participation of psyche and matter in a common ground, what he called the annus mundus, the unitary world. At the deepest level, psyche and matter are not separate, but rather are two aspects of a single reality. Normally, we experience them as distinct, the inner world of thought and feeling, the outer world of objects and events. But in synchronistic moments, the veil between them becomes thin, and we glimpse their underlying unity. This was a radical proposal that brought Jung into conversation with quantum physics, particularly through his dialogue with Wolfgang Pauli. Pauli saw parallels between the observer effect in quantum mechanics, where the act of observation influences the behavior of subatomic particles, and synchronicity, where consciousness and matter seem to interact in ways that exceed classical causality. The two men collaborated on a book, The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, which included Jung's essay on synchronicity and Pauli's reflections on quantum physics and archetypes. Mainstream science has not embraced synchronicity, seeing it as mysticism disguised as theory, an attempt to preserve meaning in a universe that operates according to physical law alone. But for those who have experienced synchronistic events, particularly in moments of psychological intensity or transformation, Jung's concept offers a framework for understanding experiences that otherwise remain inexplicable oddities. Synchronicity suggests that we live in a meaningful universe, that psyche and world are not alien to each other, but rather participants in a larger order that includes both matter and meaning. Jung's approach to religion and spirituality distinguished him sharply from Freud and from many other psychologists of his time. Where Freud saw religion as illusion, as wish fulfillment, and infantile regression, Jung saw religion as an essential expression of the psyche's nature. Human beings, he observed, are instinctively religious. They create myths and rituals, construct temples and sacred spaces, orient their lives around questions of ultimate meaning. This is not a bug in human psychology, but a feature, an indication that the psyche has a religious function. By religious function, Jung did not mean adherence to a particular creed or church, but rather the human capacity for experiencing the numinous, for encountering what Rudolf Otto called the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the overwhelming and fascinating mystery. Religious experience puts one in touch with realities that transcend the ego, that relativize personal concerns, and connect one to something greater. This can happen through formal religious practice, but it can also happen through art, nature, love, or the depths of psychological work. Jung observed that many of his patients suffered from what might be called spiritual crises of meaning rather than purely personal neuroses. They had achieved material success, established families, fulfilled social expectations, yet felt empty, as though their lives lacked significance. These patients needed not merely symptom relief, but rather connection to something that felt meaningful and real at a deep level. For these patients, psychological work took on a religious dimension, became a search for the self, for their unique place in the larger order of things. Jung's understanding of religious symbols was psychological, but not reductive. He read myths and scriptures as expressions of archetypal realities, as the collective wisdom of humanity encoded in narrative and image. The story of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection could be understood psychologically as a representation of the ego's death and transformation in the service of the self. The symbol of the cross, with its vertical and horizontal axis meeting at a center, represents the union of opposites, the tension between spirit and matter, between the vertical dimension of transcendence and the horizontal dimension of incarnation. But Jung insisted that understanding religious symbols psychologically did not exhaust their meaning. A symbol, by its nature, points beyond itself toward something that can never be fully grasped conceptually. To say that the Christ figure represents an archetype is not to say that Christ is merely psychological, because the archetype itself is a mystery, a reality that exists at the foundation of psychic life, and that may have its own connection to metaphysical realities beyond the psyche. This stance put Jung in an ambiguous position. Religious believers sometimes saw him as reducing God to a psychological complex, while atheists saw him as smuggling spirituality into psychology. Jung's response was that he was approaching religious phenomena empirically, as a psychologist observing facts of experience. The God image appears in dreams and visions. This is an observable fact. Whether there is a metaphysical God beyond the psychological image is a question Jung claimed not to be addressing. But his writing often seems to suggest more, to imply that the archetypal dimension participates in a reality that is not merely subjective. Jung's concept of the numinosum, borrowed from Rudolf Otto, is central here. Numinous experiences have a quality of overwhelming otherness, a sense that one is in the presence of something sacred, something that evokes awe and often fear. These experiences can be deeply transformative, changing a person's entire orientation to life. Jung witnessed such experiences in his patients and had experienced them himself, particularly during his confrontation with the unconscious. The numinous is not something the ego can produce or control. It comes from the depths, from the self, and it relativizes all ego concerns. In a world where traditional religious forms have lost their power for many people, Jung saw a spiritual crisis. Modern Westerners, he believed, had become cut off from the symbolic and mythic dimensions of existence, living in a disenchanted world of literalism and materialism. The churches still stood, but for many, the rituals had become empty, the doctrines unbelievable. This loss of connection to the numinous left people spiritually hungry, prey to various forms of possession by unconscious contents. Jung saw the rise of totalitarian movements in the 20th century as compensatory phenomena, mass, movements that filled the spiritual void with political religions. Nazism and communism functioned like religions, offering certainty, meaning, community, and an enemy onto whom the shadow could be projected. These movements seized people not through rational argument, but through archetypal appeal, activating deep currents in the collective psyche. The worship of the Führer or the party replaced the worship of God. But it was the same religious instinct, the same need for meaning and transcendence, now directed toward political ends. Jung believed that the task of modern individuals was to find their own relationship to the numinous, to develop what he called a personal myth. Without a living connection to myth and symbol, one lived inauthentically, cut off from the roots of meaning. This did not necessarily mean adhering to a traditional religion, though for some it might. It meant finding one's own path to the depths, through creative work, through depth psychological work, through engagement with nature or art or relationship, through whatever opened one to the archetypal dimension of existence. Jung's clinical approach reflected his theoretical understanding. He did not work with a fixed technique applied uniformly to all patients, but rather adapted his approach to the individual and their needs. He saw therapy as a dialectical process, a dialogue between two psyches in which both were affected. The analyst could not stand outside the process as a neutral observer, but was implicated in it, engaging as a whole person. Jung spoke of the wounded healer, the idea that the analyst's own wounds and struggles were not impediments to the work, but rather sources of empathy and understanding. The analyst who had confronted their own shadow, who had experienced the devastation and renewal of the individuation process, could accompany the patient on that journey. But the analyst who had not done this work would inevitably be blind to what was happening in the blind. Patient would project their own unexamined contents onto the patient, would be unable to tolerate the patient going places the analyst had not gone. The transference, in Jung's understanding, was not merely a neurotic distortion to be analyzed away, but could also be a carrier of the individuation process. When a patient projected archetypal contents onto the analyst, this could be an opportunity for those contents to become conscious. The patient who saw the analyst as a wise old man or a great mother was projecting the archetype of the self, and through the relationship, that archetype could be gradually differentiated, recognized as belonging to the patient's own psyche rather than to the actual analyst. But Jung warned against the analysts becoming inflated by such projections, believing themselves to actually be the wise guide or healer they were being experienced as. The analyst must recognize the projection as projection, must gradually help the patient withdraw the projection, and own the archetypal content as their own. This requires considerable self-awareness on the analyst's part, a willingness to be used as a container for the projection while not identifying with it. Jung also recognized that analysis could not go on forever. There comes a point where the patient must leave, must carry the work forward on their own. The analyst is a midwife for the individuation process, but individuation itself extends beyond the consulting room, encompassing the whole of life. The patient who had completed analysis in Jung's view was not cured in the sense of being fixed and finished, but rather had established a working relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, had learned to attend to dreams and symbols, had developed the capacity for ongoing psychological work. Jung's writing style evolved over the course of his career. His early works, like The Psychology of Dementia Praecox and his word association studies, were relatively conventional, scientific papers. As he developed his own psychology and moved away from the medical mainstream, his writing became more complex and elusive, requiring more of the reader. His later works, particularly those on alchemy and religion, assume familiarity with esoteric traditions and with the symbolic material he had been working with for decades. Reading Jung can be difficult. He circles around his subjects rather than proceeding linearly, returns to the same themes from different angles, uses terms in somewhat different ways in different contexts. This is partly because he is trying to describe realities that resist precise definition, that can only be approached through multiple perspectives. It is also because Jung was less interested in building a systematic theory than in honoring the complexity and mystery of the psyche itself. Jung's legacy in psychology is mixed. In academic and research psychology, he has had relatively little influence. His methods and concepts do not lend of themselves easily to experimental verification. The collective unconscious and archetypes cannot be observed directly or measured objectively. Jung's insistence on meaning, symbol, and teleology places him outside the dominant paradigms of cognitive and behavioral psychology, which focus on mechanisms and processes that can be studied empirically. In the world of psychotherapy, Jung's influence is stronger, though still concentrated in particular schools and approaches. Jungian analysts train at institutes around the world, learning dream analysis, active imagination, and the hermeneutic interpretation of symbolic material. Many non-Jungian therapists also incorporate aspects of Jung's approach, particularly his attention to dreams and his interest in the second half of life and questions of meaning. Beyond clinical psychology, Jung's impact has been considerable. In literary studies, Jungian archetypal criticism offers tools for understanding recurring patterns in literature and mythology. Joseph Campbell's work on the hero's journey, which became enormously influential in its own right, was deeply informed by Jung's ideas. In religious studies, Jung's psychological approach to religion has influenced how scholars understand ritual, myth, and religious experience. In popular culture, Jung's concepts have achieved a kind of ubiquity, though often in simplified or distorted forms. The idea of the shadow, the concept of archetypes, the introvert-extrovert distinction, these have entered common language. The notion that dreams have meaning, that there are layers of the psyche beneath conscious awareness, that symbols carry psychological significance, these ideas, which seem obvious now, were radical when Jung articulated them, and owe much of their acceptance to his influence. The question of whether Jung's psychology is scientific remains contentious. By the standards of contemporary empirical psychology, much of Jung's work would not qualify as science. His concepts are difficult to operationalize. His methods are not replicable in controlled settings. his conclusions often rest on interpretive leaps that cannot be verified independently. Yet Jung himself insisted that his work was empirical in the sense that it was based on observation of dreams, of fantasies, of clinical phenomena, of cross-cultural symbolic patterns. He was observing psychological facts and trying to understand their nature and significance. Perhaps Jung's psychology is better understood not as experimental science, but as a kind of naturalistic observation combined with hermeneutic interpretation, akin to the methods of anthropology or psychoanalysis. It offers a framework for understanding subjective experience, for making sense of symbols and images, for navigating the interior life. Whether this framework corresponds to any objective reality beyond subjective experience is a question that may not be answerable in scientific terms. Critics have also pointed to problematic aspects of Jung's life and work. His relationship with the Nazi regime, though he personally opposed to Nazism, involved compromises and statements that can be read as anti-Semitic, though this interpretation is contested. His affairs and the pain they caused, particularly to his wife Emma, raise questions about the ethics of his personal life. His gender concepts, as mentioned earlier, strike many contemporary readers as essentialist and outdated. His emphasis on the importance of religious experience can seem to privilege a particular kind of mystical sensitivity over other ways of being human. These criticisms are worth taking seriously. Jung was a man of his time, with the limitations and blind spots that implies. His work cannot simply be accepted uncritically, but neither should it be dismissed wholesale because of these issues. The question is whether, despite its limitations, Jung's psychology offers insights into human experience that remain valuable. Whether his conceptual framework helps us understand aspects of the psyche that other approaches miss. For many people, Jung's psychology resonates because it takes seriously dimensions of experience that scientific psychology ignores or explains away. The sense that dreams have meaning, the feeling of encountering something numinous in nature or art, the intuition that there are depths within oneself that are not fully known, the experience of being gripped by an image or symbol that seems to come from beyond the personal. These experiences are real for many people, and Jung offers a language for talking about them, a framework for engaging with them. Jung's insistence on meaning as a fundamental human need also speaks to many people's experience. A life without meaning, no matter how comfortable or successful externally, feels empty. Jung understood that human beings are not merely pleasure-seeking animals or stimulus-response mechanisms, but meaning-making creatures. We need not just to survive and reproduce, but to feel that our existence matters, that our struggles have significance, that we are part of something larger than ourselves. This is a psychological need as fundamental as the need for food or safety. The individuation process, as Jung described it, offers a model for psychological and spiritual development that many find compelling. It is not about achieving perfection or happiness, but about becoming whole, about integrating the multiple aspects of the personality, about establishing conscious relationship with the unconscious. It is a heroic journey in the old sense, a journey into the underworld and back, a confrontation with forces greater than the ego, a gradual transformation of the entire personality. For those engaged in this work, Jung's concepts provide a map of the territory, though each person's journey is unique. Jung also offers a corrective to the excessive rationalism and materialism of modern Western culture. He reminds us that there are other ways of knowing, that intuition and feeling are valid forms of cognition, that symbols and images carry truths that cannot be reduced to logical propositions. In a culture that values efficiency, productivity, and rational control, Jung's psychology makes space for mystery, for ambiguity, for the irrational dimensions of existence that are nonetheless real. His emphasis on holding the tension between opposites rather than resolving them prematurely is particularly relevant to our polarized times. In politics, in personal relationships, in internal conflicts, we tend to want to eliminate one side of a polarity, to declare one position right and the other wrong. Jung suggests that real development comes not from such elimination, but from holding both sides, allowing the tension to remain until a third position emerges that can encompass both. This is difficult, uncomfortable work, requiring a tolerance for ambiguity and conflict, but it may be the only way to genuine transformation, whether personal or collective. Jung's vision of the psyche as inhabited by multiple autonomous contents, as a multiplicity rather than a unity, anticipates contemporary ideas from various quarters. Neuroscience has revealed that the brain consists of multiple systems that sometimes work at cross purposes. Trauma studies have shown that the psyche can fragment under extreme stress, with dissociated parts carrying different memories and effects. These discoveries, made with different methods and different theoretical frameworks, nonetheless confirm something of what Jung observed. The psyche is not a simple unity controlled by a single ego, but rather a complex system of multiple agencies. The concept of the shadow remains especially relevant. At the individual level, psychological health requires acknowledging one's capacity for darkness, for selfishness, for the very things one condemns in others. At the collective level, the challenge of recognizing and integrating the collective shadow, the violence, exploitation, and cruelty in our history and our present is essential if we are to avoid projecting it onto others and repeating the cycles of conflict and atrocity. Jung's insistence that the second half of life has its own developmental tasks, distinct from those of youth, also addresses a genuine psychological reality. The young adult's task is to establish ego identity, to develop competence, to make their place in the world. But the person in midlife who continues to live according to those same goals often experiences a sense of futility. What was meaningful at 25 feels hollow at 50. Jung understood that the second half of life calls for a different orientation, one that turns inward, that seeks meaning and depth rather than achievement and expansion. In a culture obsessed with youth and productivity, this is a countercultural message, but one that many in midlife find speaks to their experience. The practice of attending to dreams, which Jung championed, remains valuable quite apart from any particular theoretical framework. Dreams offer a window into preoccupations, concerns, and perspectives that may not be accessible to waking consciousness. Whether one interprets them through a Jungian, Freudian, or any other lens, the simple practice of recording dreams, reflecting on them, and allowing them to inform one's self-understanding can deepen psychological awareness. Active imagination, similarly, offers a method for engaging with aspects of oneself that are not readily accessible through rational reflection. By allowing images to arise and engaging with them in a focused way, one can access intuitive knowing and creative resources that might otherwise remain dormant. The technique has been adapted and used in various forms of therapy, from Gestalt's empty chair technique to narrative therapy's externalization of problems. The underlying principle that unconscious contents can be engaged dialogically, personified, and related to has proven valuable across different therapeutic approaches. Jung's attention to symbol and image also speaks to something enduring in human experience. We live in a culture saturated with images, yet often these images are merely stimuli, advertisements, entertainment. Jung reminds us that images can be more than this, that certain images carry depth and power, that engaging seriously with symbolic material can be a path to self-knowledge. The practice of creating mandalas, which Jung used and taught to patients, has been adopted widely as a form of art therapy and meditation. The mandala, as a symbol of wholeness, offers a way of visually expressing and seeking integration. In considering Jung's place in the broader landscape of psychology and philosophy, we might see him as part of a tradition that includes the Romantic philosophers and poets, thinkers who resisted the reduction of human experience to mechanism and matter. Like the Romantics, Jung insisted on the reality and importance of imagination, symbol, and the non-rational dimensions of existence. He shared with them a sense that the human being is not fully explained by Enlightenment rationalism, that there are depths and heights that exceed the grasp of purely logical analysis. Yet Jung was also deeply grounded in the empirical tradition. He began as a medical doctor, trained in the methods of clinical observation. His theories emerged from decades of careful attention to the phenomena of mental illness and health, to the images that appeared in dreams and fantasies, to the patterns that recurred across different cultures and historical periods. He did not simply spin theories out of abstract speculation, but built his conceptual framework on the foundation of observed regularities. This combination of romantic sensibility and empirical grounding makes Jung difficult to categorize. He fits uneasily in the history of psychology, neither purely scientific nor purely philosophical. Perhaps he is best understood as a phenomenologist of the psyche, someone who attempted to describe the structures and contents of inner experience as accurately and completely as possible, using whatever conceptual tools seemed appropriate to the task. Jung's relationship to the spiritual and esoteric traditions is also complex and significant. He drew on Gnosticism, alchemy, Eastern religions, and various mystical traditions, finding in them insights into the psyche that Western scientific psychology had missed. Yet he always claimed to be approaching these traditions psychologically, studying them for what they revealed about psychological processes, rather than embracing them as metaphysical truths. This stance allowed Jung to take spiritual and esoteric materials seriously without requiring literal belief in their supernatural claims. He could study the symbolism of the Kundalini in Tantric yoga as a model of psychological development, without claiming that there is literally a serpent coiled at the base of the spine. He could explore Christian mysticism for its insights into the union of opposites without affirming Christian theology. This psychological approach to spiritual traditions has been both influential and controversial, seen by some as a way of honoring religious phenomena while remaining intellectually honest, by others as a reductive appropriation that misses the essential point of these traditions. Jung's vision of the psyche as extending beyond the individual, as participating in a collective dimension, also raises profound philosophical questions. If the deepest layer of the psyche is collective, shared by all humanity, then the boundaries of the self are less clear than our everyday experience suggests. We are not isolated monads, but rather nodes in a larger psychic field, connected to each other and to our ancestors through the collective unconscious. This vision has affinities with various spiritual and philosophical traditions that see individual consciousness as an expression of a larger consciousness. From Hindu concepts of Atman and Brahman to process philosophy's vision of interrelated occasions of experience. The question of whether the collective unconscious and archetypes are innate structures of the brain, cultural constructions that have been internalized, or something else entirely remains unresolved. Evolutionary psychology has attempted to explain universal psychological patterns through natural selection operating on cognitive adaptations. Cultural psychology emphasizes how culture shapes perception and thought. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious occupies an ambiguous space between these approaches, suggesting something that is both biological and cultural, both individual and universal. In the end, perhaps Jung's greatest contribution is not any particular theory or technique, but rather a vision of the human being as a creature of depth and mystery, a being with an interior life that matters, that is worthy of careful attention and respect. In an age of behaviorism and reductionism, of brain scans and pharmaceutical interventions, of cognitive behavioral protocols and evidence-based treatments, Jung stands as a reminder that something essential may be lost if we forget the soul, if we treat the psyche as merely a mechanism to be adjusted rather than a mystery to be explored. The language of soul is one that Jung was not afraid to use, even in a scientific context. The psyche, for Jung, is the soul, and psychology is the study of the soul. This is not a return to pre-scientific metaphysics, but rather an insistence that certain realities, meaning value, purpose, the felt sense of depth and significance, are psychological facts that cannot be explained away or reduced to simpler terms. They must be engaged on their own level, in their own language, which is the language of symbol and myth. Jung invites us to take our inner life seriously, to pay attention to dreams and images and intuitions, to engage in the difficult work of self-knowledge. He suggests that this work is not optional, not a luxury for those with time and resources, but rather a fundamental human task. We are called to individuation, to becoming who we truly are beneath the layers of social conditioning and ego identification. This is not self-improvement in the consumerist sense, but rather a radical transformation, a death and rebirth of the personality, a journey that requires courage and honesty and patience. The journey of individuation is also, in Jung's vision, a service to the collective. By becoming more conscious, by integrating our own shadows, by withdrawing our projections, we contribute to the consciousness of the whole. A society of more individuated people would be less prone to mass movements and collective possessions, more capable of holding complexity and ambiguity, more able to honor difference without either eliminating it or demonizing it. This is perhaps an idealistic vision, but it suggests that psychological work is not merely self-involved, but has ethical and social dimensions. In our contemporary moment, with its multiple crises, ecological, political, spiritual, Jung's psychology may offer resources for navigation, the capacity to hold tension without premature resolution, to tolerate ambiguity, to recognize the shadow in oneself and one's group, to find meaning in the midst of chaos. These capacities, which individuation develops, are precisely what our times demand. The challenges we face are not merely technical problems to be solved through better policies or technologies, but rather reflect deep psychic conflicts, both individual and collective that require the kind of inner work Jung described. The ecological crisis, for instance, might be understood partly as a failure to recognize our participation in nature, our inability to integrate the instinctual, earthy dimension of existence that we have split off and projected. We have treated nature as object, as resource to be exploited, rather than recognizing it as part of the larger self, the totality of which we are a part. Reintegrating the ecological shadow, recognizing our kinship with the non-human world, may require the kind of symbolic and imaginal work that Jung's psychology facilitates. Similarly, our political polarization reflects a failure to integrate shadow contents both individually and collectively. Each side projects its darkness onto the other, seeing the opponent as evil incarnate while maintaining its own purity. The capacity to recognize one's own group's shadow, to admit that one's own side is capable of the very sins it condemns in the other, would not eliminate political differences, but it might allow for a more honest and less destructive form of conflict. Jung's interest in the numinous in religious experience also speaks to a widespread spiritual hunger. In contemporary culture, many people, particularly in the West, have left behind traditional religious forms but still seek connection to something transcendent, something that gives life depth and meaning. Jung's psychology offers a framework for this seeking that does not require adherence to any particular dogma. The sacred can be encountered in the depths of the psyche, in the images and symbols that arise spontaneously, in the process of individuation itself. At the same time, Jung's work invites caution about the dangers of spiritual inflation, of identifying oneself with archetypal energies, of confusing psychological insights with metaphysical certainties. The person who has encountered numinous experiences in deep psychological work may be tempted to see themselves as specially chosen, as enlightened, or possessing secret knowledge. Jung was clear that such inflation is a danger of the work, a failure to maintain the distinction between ego and self. The goal is not to become the self, but to serve it, to establish conscious relationship with it, while maintaining the integrity and humility of ego consciousness. Jung's own life exemplifies both the possibilities and the dangers of depth psychological work. His confrontation with the unconscious was immensely creative, producing insights and concepts that have enriched our understanding of the psyche. But it also took a tremendous toll, bringing him to the edge of psychosis, complicating his relationships, isolating him professionally. Not everyone needs to, or should, undertake the kind of intense inner journey Jung pursued. For some, a more measured approach, a more boundaried engagement with the unconscious is appropriate. This is one reason why Jung emphasized the importance of the analyst, the guide who has been through the territory and can help the analysand navigate it safely. The descent into the unconscious should not be undertaken lightly or alone. There must be a thread back to consciousness, a relationship to another person who can help maintain perspective when the ego is overwhelmed by unconscious contents. This is the therapeutic relationship at its best, not a technique applied by an expert to a passive patient, but a mutual engagement in which both participants are present as whole human beings. Jung's vision of therapy as a dialectical process, a mutual engagement, has influenced many subsequent therapeutic approaches, from humanistic psychology to intersubjective psychoanalysis. The idea that the therapist's own subjectivity is not a contaminant to be eliminated, but rather an essential instrument of the work, that therapy involves two psyches in relationship rather than a subject studying an object, These ideas have become increasingly accepted, though they remain in tension with more medical models of treatment. In the training of psychotherapists, Jung's emphasis on the analyst's own psychological work, their own confrontation with the unconscious, their own ongoing individuation, has been highly influential. The requirement that analysts undergo their own analysis, that they continue to work on themselves throughout their career, reflects Jung's insight that one can only guide another as far as one has gone oneself. The unexamined therapist will inevitably impose their own unconscious contents on the client, will project rather than perceive, will offer what they need rather than what the client needs. Jung's concept of the wounded healer also speaks to an important reality in therapeutic work. Many people are drawn to become therapists because of their own wounds, their own psychological struggles. Rather than seeing this as a problem, Jung suggests it can be a source of wisdom and empathy. The therapist who has known depression can accompany a depressed client with genuine understanding. The therapist who has grappled with their own shadow can recognize and respect the client's struggle with theirs. The wound, when it has been worked with and integrated, becomes a source of healing capacity. But this requires that the wound has indeed been worked with, that it is not still raw and unconscious. The therapist whose wounds remain unexamined will be triggered by the client's material, will use the client to meet their own needs, will reenact old patterns rather than facilitating new possibilities. This is why ongoing supervision and personal work are essential for therapists, why the training never really ends. In reflecting on Jung's place in the history of ideas, we might see him as part of a lineage of thinkers who have explored the interior dimensions of human existence, not in order to turn away from the world, but in order to understand the deep sources of how we perceive and engage with the world. Socrates' injunction to know thyself, Plotinus's journey inward to the source of being, Augustine's confessions of the interior life, Meister Eckhart's exploration of the ground of the soul, Jung stands in this tradition of interiority, but with the tools and perspectives of modern psychology. Yet Jung also draws on non-Western traditions, recognizing that Eastern religions and philosophies have explored consciousness and its transformations with a sophistication that Western thought largely lacks. His engagement with the I Ching, with Zen Buddhism, with Hindu concepts of chakras and kundalini, with the Taoist imagery of the golden flower, represents an attempt to bridge Eastern and Western approaches to the psyche. Whether Jung fully understood these traditions or whether he to some extent co-opted them for his own purposes is debatable, but his openness to learning from non-Western sources was unusual for his time and expanded the conceptual resources available to depth psychology. The question of Jung's legacy going forward is open. In academic psychology, his influence has waned rather than grown. The discipline has moved toward greater emphasis on neuroscience, on quantitative methods, on evidence-based treatments that can be manualized and tested. The subjective, qualitative, interpretive approach that Jung exemplified does not fit easily into this paradigm. It is possible that Jung will be remembered primarily as a historical figure, an interesting thinker who offered some useful ideas, but whose overall approach has been superseded. Yet, it is also possible that Jung's psychology will prove to have lasting value precisely because it addresses dimensions of human experience that more reductive approaches cannot adequately capture. As the limitations of purely biological psychiatry become increasingly evident, As people continue to seek meaning and depth in their psychological work, as the need for psychological frameworks that can engage with spirituality without requiring supernatural belief becomes more pressing, Jung's ideas may find renewed relevance. In the broader culture, Jung's influence seems likely to endure, even if in fragmented and popularized forms. The language he gave us, archetypes, the collective unconscious, the shadow, introversion, and extroversion, has entered common usage. Stories are analyzed in terms of the hero's journey and archetypal patterns. People speak of doing shadow work, of integrating their anima or animus, of individuation. Whether these uses of Jungian concepts reflect deep engagement with his actual thought or merely superficial appropriation varies, but the concepts themselves have proven to have staying power. Perhaps, in the end, Jung's work is best understood not as a fixed body of doctrine to be accepted or rejected, but as an invitation to explore, to pay attention to the images and symbols that arise from the depths, to take the interior life seriously, to engage in the difficult, lifelong work of becoming conscious. The specific concepts and frameworks Jung developed may prove to be provisional, subject to revision and debate. But the fundamental orientation, the conviction that the psyche has depths worth exploring, that symbols and myths carry psychological truth, that the journey toward wholeness is a central human task, may be his enduring contribution. In our contemporary world of constant stimulation, of surface and speed, of external focus and achievement orientation, Jung's call to turn inward, to slow down and attend to the depths, feels countercultural and perhaps even subversive. To take one's dreams seriously, to spend time in active imagination, to reflect on the symbolic dimensions of experience. These practices do not serve the goals of productivity and consumption. They serve the goal of wholeness, of becoming more fully human, of living a life of depth and meaning, rather than mere busyness. This is not a rejection of the outer world or of engagement with social and political realities. Jung was clear that individuation does not mean withdrawal into solipsistic introspection. The individuated person is more capable of genuine relationship, more able to contribute to the collective, more solid in their ethical stance, because it arises from inner conviction rather than mere conformity. But individuation does require that a certain amount of energy be withdrawn from the outer world and directed inward, that one create space for reflection and inner work amidst the demands of daily life. The practice of regular quiet time, of meditation or reflective journaling, of attending to dreams and inner images, of creating art or engaging with nature in a contemplative way. These practices create the conditions for the kind of inner work Jung described. They are the equivalent in ordinary life of the intensive analytical work that happens in the consulting room. They require discipline and commitment, carving out time and space that could be used for other things, defending that space against the encroachment of busyness and distraction. In the end, Jung invites us to befriend the unconscious, to see it, not as an enemy to be conquered or a source of pathology to be eliminated, but as a partner in the work of becoming whole. The unconscious compensates consciousness, brings what is lacking, points toward directions of growth. When we listen to it, attend to its messages in dreams and images and symptoms, engage with it through active imagination and creative work, we enter into a dialogue that can transform us. This dialogue is the essence of individuation, the conversation between ego and self, between consciousness and the unconscious, between what we know ourselves to be and what we might become. It is a conversation that continues throughout life, that deepens and evolves, that brings us more and more into alignment with our true nature. It is not always comfortable or easy. It requires acknowledging aspects of ourselves we would rather deny, relinquishing identifications and certainties we have clung to, accepting ambiguity and paradox. But the alternative, Jung suggests, is a half-life, a life lived on the surface, a life of conformity and persona in which the deeper self remains unrealized. For those who feel the call to something more, to a life of depth and meaning, Jung's psychology offers a path and a set of tools. It is a demanding path, requiring courage and patience and honesty. But for those who walk it, it promises a kind of fulfillment that comes not from external success, but from inner alignment, from the sense of living in accordance with one's deepest truth. As we come to the close of our long night's journey through the life and work of Carl Gustav Jung, let us rest in the realization that the exploration of the psyche is never complete, that the unconscious remains forever mysterious, that the journey of individuation continues as long as consciousness endures. Jung did not provide final answers, but rather open doors, pointing toward depths that each person must explore for themselves. His life exemplified the courage required to undertake this exploration, to descend into one's own darkness and return with knowledge, to walk the edge between consciousness and chaos, to maintain one's integrity, while opening to the overwhelming power of the archetypal. His work provides maps of the territory, though the territory itself must be traversed by each individual according to their own path. In a world that often feels fragmented and meaningless, where traditional sources of meaning have lost their power for many, where technological change outpaces our capacity to integrate it psychologically, Jung's vision of individuation as a lifelong journey toward wholeness offers an alternative. It suggests that meaning is not given from outside, but must be discovered within, through engagement with the depths of the psyche, through attending to the symbols and images that arise spontaneously, through the difficult work of integrating consciousness and the unconscious. The work is never finished. The psyche continually produces new contents, new dreams, new challenges. Each stage of life brings new tasks, new opportunities for growth, new calls from the self. The individuating person remains open to this ongoing process, willing to be transformed, willing to relinquish old identities when they no longer serve, willing to embrace new possibilities even when they are frightening or difficult. Jung's legacy is not a system to be memorized or a doctrine to be believed, but an invitation to embark on the journey, to explore the interior continents, to listen to the whispers rising from the depths, to engage with the images that carry meanings beyond words. In accepting this invitation, we join a lineage of seekers who have understood that the unexamined life is not worth living, that self-knowledge is both a psychological necessity and a spiritual path, that the journey inward is also somehow a journey toward the source of all meaning. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let the images and ideas wash over you, settling into the deep places where consciousness and unconscious meet. Let Jung's words and concepts become dreams, transforming in the night into your own symbols, your own meanings. The work of individuation happens not only in waking reflection, but in the depths of sleep, where the unconscious weaves its own tapestries, speaks its own truths. May you rest well, and may your dreams bring whispers of the self, intimations of wholeness, symbols of the journey ahead. The psyche knows its own path. Our task is simply to listen, to attend, to follow where it leads, with courage and with trust. Good night, wanderer. May the depths receive you gently, and may you wake renewed, carrying forward the eternal work of becoming who you truly are.